This is Andy Gutierrez from StarWars.com, and you are listening to Coffee with Kenobi with Dan Z. This is the podcast you're looking for.
This is James Arnold Taylor, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi. I have a good feeling about this.
Joining us today for a cup of coffee to talk about his brand new book, Star Wars Brotherhood, is author Mike Chen. Mike, welcome to Coffee with Kenobi.
Hello there. Thank you for having me. I'm a longtime listener.
Wow, that's just so surreal to me. It's an honor and a privilege to speak with you, my friend. Your brand new book, Star Wars Brotherhood, is really, really something special. And I am excited to ask you all these questions. But let's talk about how you first fell in love with the Star Wars saga.
Well, Star Wars is something that has been in my blood since I was born, really. So I was born in 1978, and you can even see in like early Christmas pictures. There's one that like I show friends where I think I'm 3, my brother is 5, and we both have gotten just like Empire Strikes Back toys for Christmas. And so I have very, very specific memories from things that I've gotten from Toys R Us. The Tauntaun, the vinyl Tauntaun with like the slit in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
Like I remember that. There was another Hoth playset where it was like, I think it was the Ion Cannon one where it pops up and it explodes.
We had with the probe droid.
Yes, that
Yeah.
one. Yeah. We had that. We had the snow speeder with the lights on it, like the cannons were lights, and the cannons fell off like after a few weeks. So yeah, it's like all these little memories of, I guess, the merchandise really, like where, God, when I was at Kmart with my mom, and they had the Han Solo blaster, and this is when sounds were still really bad in toys. I remember it just kind of sounded like it was wheezing. It was like wah, and I just begged them for that. So like through the original trilogy, like I saw Return of the Jedi in the theaters. We always watched it when it was on TV, and then as it started to cycle through in the 80s and then into the 90s, the Thrawn trilogy was really, really big. Like it felt like something monumental. And my best friend and I, we were in high school for I think the second book, and my local like Walden Books had like a release party, which meant they carted out like the TV on the VHS, and like so they just played it in the background while they sold books. Little things like that where it's always just been present. One of the biggest moments of the 90s for me was when X-Wing came out for PC. I remember my dad worked next to the his office was next to the Fry's Electronics in San Jose. So I'm like, please go to Fry's on your way back and pick up this game. It's a Star Wars game. You can't miss it. And he brought it back. And for me, when I think of the original trilogy, the thing that I love most about like the one piece of like merchandise or design or whatever is the X-Wing. So I have always dreamed of flying an X-Wing. Like when I was little, like I made Legos with like X-Wings using like the bendy parts, and like the bendy parts could never stay up because there's too much weight on them. So to play X-Wing was just like mind blowing for me. So when I have PlayStation VR and I played Star Wars Squadrons on it, it was like I've been waiting my whole life to do that. So yeah, it's in my blood. It's something that's always been a part of me. And even my wife, she's also a really big nerd, and we met in 2002. On our first date, she had a Princess Leia t-shirt on, and like that was like Attack of the Clones time, so there was merchandise, but it's not like now, where like every child has Star Wars stuff. It was like still pretty, nerdy to wear it. So like we noticed that right away. And then like on our third date, it was our second date, we went to go see Attack of the Clones again, which, we're still married. So, so that clearly worked out. So yeah, it's been a big part of my life. And like even with my daughter, I have an article that I wrote for Nerdist where we introduced my daughter to it using the machete order. Like we protected her from spoilers for like 4.5 years. And then we did the machete order with her, an augmented machete order. I always have to point that out because we put in the Phantom Menace and several Clone Wars episodes in there. So it's constantly on my mind. I think about everything in Star Wars quotes, and except when I'm watching Star Trek or Doctor Who, then my brain shifts. But it's very present in my life.
Oh, wow. What a great story. You and I have a lot in common, my friend. Real quick thing aside on that X-Wing game. Remember in those X-Wing games and like the sequels and then the TIE Fighter game, that was the only place to see Lucasfilm and Star Wars merchandise for a while in the 90s. And it was in those little catalogs that came in the box
Yes.
themselves.
Yeah. I would read those like magazines over and over again just to look at the
Yes.
pictures.
Oh, it was absolute gold. Speaking of gold, please walk us through the moment when you first learned you would be writing Star Wars Brotherhood.
Wow, that was it's like very cemented in my mind, because it's like this confluence of so many like in the pandemic everything was been like heightened. So I'll go back a little bit before that. So in 2015 I signed Eric Smith, who is my literary agent, and so right after that, like we talked about, like, well, beyond your first book, what other stuff do you want to do? Like, what are your pie in the sky dream projects? And I said, I want to write a Star Wars book, and very specifically, I want to write a prequel era Star Wars book, so that like if they ever go there, like please put my name in for things. Um, and From a certain point of view, they started getting the authors for that, I think in summer of 2020. And my agent told me that he thinks I have a shot at that, like, because he knows the Del Rey editorial team. And then it was like a week after that, he called me and he said like, "Oh, Lucasfilm wants you. You get ready to do a Star Wars story." And for that one specifically, I asked like, what characters are left for from a certain point of view, because I figured like they'd probably have already talked to a bunch of authors. And so I got a short list, and I saw there are characters like the droid on Cloud City that swears it's C-3PO, like this Imperial commander on the bridge, things like that. And I saw like Palpatine was on the list, and I go like, why hasn't anyone picked Palpatine yet? And Tom, the editor, goes, I think people are a little intimidated by writing Palpatine. And so I went, I looked at the list, and I was only supposed to submit like one or two pitches, but I wrote five. And most of them were like just funny stories about like, the protocol droid or whatever. But then I'm like, if I audition for Lucasfilm, if this is what this is, I have to do like go big or go home. So I wrote a pitch for Palpatine discovering who Luke Skywalker is, and how he senses it through like his connection with Anakin. And I was surprised they actually let me write it. So that's in the From a Certain Point of View, The Empire Strikes Back anthology. It's called Disturbance. And the audio for that is read by Sam Witwer. So it's just incredible. He does it totally in his Sithy voice. So that happened, and I thought, okay, well, if I only have one shot at Star Wars, like I made a mark. Like I wrote something that is going to be in Wikipedia, like for like in terms of like defining a canon moment. So then fast forward to May of last year. So we are doing homeschool kindergarten during the pandemic, which is like the worst thing ever. So I'm like trying to do my day job while my daughter is like, remotely connected to her teacher, and like I'm trying to keep her in place. And then my agent calls, and it was funny because I picked up the phone and I said right away, "Why are you calling? I don't have anything on submission." And he said, "How would you like to write a Star Wars book?" And I suddenly forgot about kindergarten going on next to me. And I'm like, "Yes, I would like to write a Star Wars book." And then he goes, "It's about Obi-Wan and Anakin." And I'm just kind of like, trying not to just stutter and explode my words. So I'm trying to get details for it. And then my wife comes home and she hears me say Clone Wars, and then she's like, "What?" And then I go like, "It's Eric," and then she's like, "Do it, do it, do it." And then so she's like eavesdropping while she's like maintaining kindergarten, and I say like, "Well, what's the schedule?" Because I know Lucasfilm has like this really compressed writing schedule, and my wife just like yells like, "Do it, we'll make it work, we'll figure it out, do it, do it, do it." So that was that. I mean, like I was in the middle of early drafting of my next HarperCollins book at the time, and I was like, how are we going to do this? But it's Star Wars. I have to make it work. And back at the Nebula conference in 2019, I was hanging out with Rebecca Roanhorse, and I asked her specifically, like, how do you write a Star Wars book? And she's like, well, they have to call your agent, and they pick you, not the other way around. And then she said, like, then you have to drop everything and do it because you've only got like 3 or 4 months for that first draft. And I'm like, haha, that's impossible. And she's like, yeah, it's a good thing I'm not in my day job anymore because I don't know how I was going to do this. And then then I was actually like faced with the prospect of that. But we made it work. It's something you have to make it work.
Yeah, because you're doing Star Wars. You're actually doing Star Wars. I love that story. So what was your research like for the book? I mean, I know before the show started, we talked about our love of the saga and how we eat, drink, and live Star Wars. But what was your research like for this particular book?
Okay, so I'm going to tiptoe around spoilers here because there are a lot of ties to previous books and media. So I will say that I revisited. I've been tweeting about a prerequisite reading list, like if this was a college course.
Which I love.
So I would say things I revisited were Master and Apprentice and the Matthew Stover Revenge of the Sith novelization, and also E.K. Johnston's Queen's Hope. And I'll get to that in a second. But I do want to say that there's a lot of media that covers the Clone Wars period in different formats. And this takes place before the Clone Wars movie. So the way I thought about some of those things was it's the stylized adaptation for the HoloNet, like a biopic where it's 75% accurate, but then condensed or altered for style purposes. So those things, I revisited them. I wanted to make sure that if I touched on things that I could find in other media, like I wanted to make it work as best as possible. Not just because of like logistical purposes, but because I also loved that other stuff too. And then like the Lucasfilm team, like they make sure like they smooth it out because it's really difficult to connect all those things. With Queen's Hope, when I knew I was going to be doing this, I immediately pinged E.K. Johnston and I asked her if she would be okay with me like sending her sections. But hold on one second. I'm going to turn this off here. Okay, let me start that over.
It was Matt Martin from Lucasfilm calling you, probably.
Right? Yeah, like what have you done? So I immediately contacted E.K. Johnston and I asked if she would be okay with me sending her like sections and ideas and stuff because she's like the master of Padme. Like I wanted to make sure I got the Padme stuff right. So I got an advanced copy of Queen's Hope, and then also Kate sent over her various outlines that she had. And so specifically, I told her I need input on Padme's wardrobe because Padme's wardrobe is so important to like the different personas that she puts on. But I'm as a person and a writer, I really don't care about clothing at all. So I did things where like I would say like Padme and Anakin are here doing this. What would she be wearing? And then Kate would send over, a rough list. I would ask her like, which bodyguard would she be with, or which handmaiden would she be with? And given the events of Queen's Hope, like, who would know what? What are their relationships? Things like that. And then when I was done drafting the Padme sections, I would send it to her for her to read, just to make sure, like, does this sound like Padme? Because the way I the way I internalized Padme is very much based on those books, and how Padme is like this balance of like being very passionate but then being very like controlled and constructive, and like her mind is like constantly thinking of like, how do we solve this, how do we help people, like in like on a systemic level. And I wanted to make sure that I carried that through. So for the sections with her, because she's not in it too much, but her sections are very pivotal. So I wanted to make sure that it was everything linked up, like both in terms of like sequence of events with Queen's Hope, but also who Padme is as a person. So I took it very seriously.
Yes. Well, and it shows. It shows you. I love that there's like a collaborative nature between all the authors too. And again, I know this book is set after Attack of the Clones. Where does it take place specifically during the Clone Wars animated series, if you're allowed to say?
So it's between them. It acts as the bridge between, bickering Anakin and Obi-Wan at the end of Attack of the Clones, and the brotherly team that you see at the beginning of the Clone Wars movie. So the timeline is specifically Attack of the Clones, and then E.K. Johnston's Queen's Hope, and then my book, and then some undefined period of time where they could stick other stories in there if they wanted to. I would say like unofficially probably like several months still happen before the Clone Wars movie, but then that happens. So it's not a spoiler to say that Ahsoka is not in this. And I've been asked that a bit, because there were some sites that thought this took place during the Clone Wars series, and it does not. It takes place before that. So I want to make sure readers have their expectations set. Like, Ahsoka is not in this. She hasn't entered the picture yet, and I think she shouldn't be part of this part of Anakin and Obi-Wan's journey yet. Because they've still got to figure some stuff out.
Right, and they haven't, and he hasn't even met Ahsoka yet.
Exactly. Yeah. So like, I wanted to. I don't think it's a spoiler. Like, if you just read the back of, or if you read the summary, it's like it takes place shortly after Attack of the Clones. Then, like, logistically, Ahsoka shouldn't even be in there, so she's not in
right. I agree. Yeah, and honestly, if it helps, when I saw the description, I'm like, well, there's no way Ahsoka's in this one, so that makes sense. Yeah. So let's look at the main characters of the novel individually before we talk about their dynamic as a tandem. What makes Obi-Wan Kenobi tick, and how did you bring this aspect of him to life in Star Wars Brotherhood?
So Obi-Wan, I've seen Obi-Wan as like, even when he is like damaged and beaten down, like, what we're seeing in the trailer for the upcoming series. I think even with that, like, he's still one of the like few like real true North characters out there, and he has like such belief in things. I've always felt like the only thing he doesn't fully believe in is himself. He's got like a bit of imposter syndrome in him, and this is explored a bit in Claudia Gray's Master and Apprentice. So I wanted to really play off of that, because this book takes place where Anakin has just been knighted. So this thing that has joined them together and kind of defined, Obi-Wan's purpose for so long is like no longer there. And so he's kind of unsure of how to approach things. So when I talk with Kirsten White a lot. She's writing the upcoming Padawan book. When we were both almost finished with our manuscripts, we were comparing Obi-Wan character notes. And I said, like, oh yeah, and imposter syndrome. And she goes, oh yeah, I have that too. So it's good that like we both saw that like that is kind of fundamental to Obi-Wan, because he's always wondering, like, can I do better? And one of the themes of this book is how the Jedi have basically already lost, because they are not built for a war of this scope. And so being a true North person like Obi-Wan, it only works when the system works. But Palpatine has completely undermined the system. So Obi-Wan, he still has this belief in the system. He believes in the Jedi. And he is just trying to maintain that. There's a lot of talk in the book about faith and good faith in a bad faith world. And so that's really who Obi-Wan is. He has this belief that good faith will always win out. And that's kind of impossible when Palpatine is rigging the system. So his biggest concern is is he good enough to live up to these ideals of good faith and a system that works? And also the promise of what he gave, or the promise he gave to Qui-Gon Jinn. And Qui-Gon is, I wanted to make the weight of Qui-Gon Jinn for both Obi-Wan and Anakin be very, very present, even though he's only mentioned a few times.
Right, but there's power in that. There's a different power in that. Well, I love that, and I think it adds an interesting layer, brings out an interesting layer of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and fascinating. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, I don't think Anakin has imposter syndrome, so that's a nice little balance there. So let's talk about Anakin. What's important to bring to life about this essential character?
So Anakin is like all feelings all the time. His feelings are really like they're turned up to 11, which is a problem when he's part of an institution that says like let go of your emotional attachment. One of my favorite books of all time, not just Star Wars, but just like of all time, it's so incredible, is The Revenge of the Sith novelization by Matthew Stover. And one of the things that I really love about that book is it really leans into character. And when you get in Anakin's head, like he is like super emo, like he's very all about like his feelings are really on the surface and he's fighting to tamp them down. But it feels really right for who this character is and the journey that you think that when you think about like, you know, he's had all of his support systems taken away from him at an early age. So of course he would just be all like unresolved feelings. Like it makes complete sense. So he needs a mentor who can recognize that and work with that and teach him to temper it. But with all due respect to Obi-Wan and the brotherly relationship he has for Anakin, it is brotherly. Anakin needed Qui-Gon. He needed someone who can recognize the flaws in the institutional system so he could carve out like a more accommodating path for Anakin, because Anakin really, really cares about stuff, but he doesn't know how to consolidate that with the feelings of injustice that constantly pop up. And Obi-Wan's just kind of like is like, you know, square peg in a round hole, like trying to make it work within like the system of the Jedi that he has faith in. Qui-Gon wouldn't have done that. Qui-Gon would have like molded him a little bit differently. And that's what Palpatine exploits. So Anakin just never really quite got the like during those vital teenage years when you really need to learn how to control your feelings. Anakin never quite got that, and poor guy is just winging it the whole time.
This is Vanessa Marshall, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi.
And then that's exactly why they're kind of a dream team for a storyteller like yourself, because they are able to balance each other out. And what kind of is the secret recipe to that? Because you've obviously got a lot of history with Clone Wars, and of course the films. And so, what is it that you add to that maybe adds kind of a new little wrinkle or perspective?
I think the big thing is that this is a bridge. It's the point where Anakin and Obi-Wan, so like at the end of Attack of the Clones, I mean, you even see it as they go into Geonosis, and Anakin's like, I gotta save Padme, and then Obi-Wan's like, no, you don't. You know, so like there's still butting heads there, but then like if you're watching this for the first time and you go from that and then you jump into the Clone Wars movie and you're like, hey, these two guys are just like joking with each other while they fight and stuff. So like what quite happened there? And so for me, I'm looking at this on a character level, like going from the bickering master and apprentice that you see in Attack of the Clones, and then like really trying to dig deep underneath the surface to see like why are they fighting so much? Like why are they bickering so much? And then how could something like that possibly get smoothed over by the time the Clone Wars start? Because not that much time has passed. So it was really important to think like this was always there, like the potential for that was always there, but the framework for how they view each other was being forced by being in master and apprentice roles. And once you remove that, they can start to recognize the value in each other without without assigning like the limitations of you are my master or you are my apprentice. Instead, it can be like we are equals and we can work together because we really do complement each other. So I thought about, for me personally, like growing up with my older brother, like we basically just fought all the time until he went to college. um, and then I remember like the first time he came back from college, because we were both really big music nerds, and he like I was just so ready to like just argue with him about all the stupid stuff that brothers argue about, and he's like, hey, you want to go to Tower Records with me? And I'm like, yeah, I do. And so like removing that framework of like we are living together under our parents, and as opposed to him being like, I'm basically an adult now, and like you're older, like let's go do this thing we both enjoy. Um, like that's kind of like a parallel with what's going on here. It's like these two men who are now both men, like no longer have to fit within a box, and then because you've removed that, then they can see how like they naturally fit together.
I love it, which is why the title is perfect.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in this, both just as a fan of you and your work and the story, but as a writer myself, what kind of challenges are present in telling the story, and how did you overcome them?
So writing this was actually really fast and really easy. I remember the first time I wrote, um, after we approved the outline, and I sat down and I'm like, I am going to start writing my Star Wars book. And I usually write, on a good day, I write like 1,500 words. Like on a slow day, I write like 500 to 600. And I sat down the first night and I wrote like 5,000 words. It was just like flowing out of my head. Um, and I grew up writing fan fiction. I did that mostly with, I did a lot of like comic strips when I was younger. Like I didn't write too much fan fiction in prose, but like that's where my brain is always heading. Like fan fiction is as much entertainment as watching a show or playing a video game for me. So that's what this felt like. I actually told one of my friends when I was drafting this that like it felt um like I was almost playing like an RPG in my head, like where I was
Mhm.
controlling the characters and making the decisions. So the hardest part of it was, I mentioned that this book dropped into my schedule while I was on deadline with another book. So that was the really like the hardest part about it. My HarperCollins editor, my agent called her and said like, Mike got offered a Star Wars book, but it's going to go like it's landing like right in the middle of this deadline. So they agreed to push it by 2 months. And I think, they
Wow.
recognize the value of like a very high profile project for someone like me. So they're, from like a sales and marketing perspective, they're probably like, that's totally fine. We'll make it work. So then the hardest part was really just like the rapid turnaround, because I had my day job and pandemic parenting. So this is going into, we outlined between May and August of 2021. And at the time, we thought that we were sending our daughter back to school. My wife is immunocompromised, so we've always had to like do everything like extra cautiously during this. So then when Delta hit, we're like, oh no, we have to do homeschool first grade to start the fall. Um, so we had to work around that. We had to work around like my day job, and then like finding time to do this while still making incremental progress on the other book. And so my wife was really understanding that there would be some nights where we'd put our daughter to bed and she just wouldn't see me for a few hours. But I mentioned that she's a really big fan too, so she was okay with that. She was very, very encouraging. Um, so that was like logistically, like that was probably just the hardest part about it. Like it wasn't like writing process or anything. It was just trying to find the time for it. And it was funny because I would write so fast, like the words would just like dump out of my head, and then I'd go back and read it, and there's just like typos everywhere because I was writing so fast. But I really did feel like if if I didn't have parenting and I didn't have my day job and like real world things like that, I could just sit down and like write for 24 hours a day. Like it was just, it's so much fun. And I think that's really the saving grace of getting a project like that in a high stress moment, is it becomes the de-stressor.
Right. That's so inspiring. It really, really is. It's really, really cool because it's like an outlet and a catharsis, but you've been thinking and dreaming about this moment consciously and subconsciously your entire Star Wars life. So
Yeah,
that is
yeah.
that's fabulous.
It felt like writing the dialogue was so natural. Like, I felt like I knew, like, am I doing like the Hayden voice right now, or am I doing the Matt Lanter voice right now?
Hmm.
And what bridges them? And like these are things I've already thought about. So like they came
Right.
really, really naturally.
Well, I was going to ask you what inspired you throughout your literary journey, but I feel like you've kind of nailed that already. Unless there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I would say like the main thing is with something like this, it's it feels easier and different from my other work. Like with my original work, like that first draft is like pulling teeth because like I don't know the rules of the world that I'm in. I don't know the voices of it. So to be able to write something where I'm like, I know all this, I just get to put them in the sandbox and play. I mean, that's what writing IP is like, and I feel like I've talked with other IPs about auditioning for them or possibly doing a project for them, and there have been some that I've actually turned down because I'm like, I don't know the IP enough. I enjoy it, but I don't know it in my bones, and I feel like that
Mhm.
would be a hindrance on like such a short turnaround time. But then for this, I'm like, I knew I knew the voices. I knew how to like get into Anakin's head, because I think he's probably like of all the characters, Anakin's the most complex.
Yes.
Because dude's got a lot going on in this world.
Yes.
So I feel like, but that wasn't going to be a challenge because like I understand like the push and pull, and like I've had arguments with friends about this before, so like I can defend Anakin. So it's yeah, it's like the writing process was just really accelerated, but it was a lot of fun.
That's fantastic. So we're gonna shift gears and just do some fun questions here to wrap up the show.
Sure.
What would you say is your favorite Star Wars movie?
Okay, so I'm gonna cheat because it's like it always depends on like my mood. Um, I would say okay, so I would say the best Star Wars movie is The Empire Strikes Back because it is a perfect
Mhm.
film from start to finish. There's not a single frame like wasted in terms of pace. The performances are all great. The visual direction is all great. So Empire Strikes Back is a perfect film and like fundamental to my life. Um, my favorite film might be Revenge of the Sith. One of the things
Mhm.
I love about Revenge of the Sith is that it just feels like there's like this horrible momentum through it this whole time. Like even in its slow moments when it's like mostly like character and dialogue after they save Palpatine, there just is like this creeping dread through the whole thing that like something bad is happening. And I don't you have to be like a Star Wars fan to sense that. And I love that about this film is like you can see these characters are trying to do right, but then everything around them is falling apart. And like being a former goth teenager, I love that about storytelling. Um, but I think, and I'll also cheat by saying the one that I put on in the background the most when I'm like doing stuff is Rogue One because Rogue One is just
Cool.
fantastic, and I like how it's sectioned off that I can just like dip into it and enjoy it.
Right. That's cool. Yeah, I think I do agree that like they kind of change based on different perspectives too, and yeah, love that. All right, so I'm really interested in this one. Do you have a favorite character?
I have like 10 favorite characters.
Yes,
so
same.
so yeah, I'm like you like the ones that I find the most fascinating are usually like the prequel ones, like Anakin, Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, Count Dooku, Ahsoka. Um, I will say that really loved Anakin before. I mean, in because of Clone Wars, because of the prequels, because of like the Matthew Stover book. But after writing this and like spending so much time like directly in his head, I'm like, no one better ever say anything bad about Anakin Skywalker me again, because I will go to the mat for that dude. Because I feel like I understand him so much, even though like one of the things that like I constantly get into arguments with my friends about Anakin is like, but he killed younglings. I'm like, I know, I totally get that. He made that choice, but he is, as a character, he is such a good example of someone who is essentially ignored and abused by the system that's supposed to support him.
Mhm.
And when you have a villain like Palpatine who like sees this and says, "Oh, your support system is Obi-Wan. Oh, your support system is secretly Padme." Like, well, what if we take those away? What if we give you every chance to fail as you possibly can? And what if we take like the guy who's supposed to be the head of the institution, Mace Windu, and you just butt heads with him all the time? Like, let's put you in these situations where like your toxic feelings can really stew instead of having the support that you really, really need. And I find that really, really fascinating in that like you can love a character and see all the flaws and not agree with them, but still like root for him the whole time. Like I was talking with E.K. Johnston about Anakin and Padme, and I asked her, like, if Mace Windu had arrested Palpatine, do you think they would have made it? And she sat there and she's like, yeah, I think they would. And I'm like, yeah, I think so too. I think
Yeah.
Anakin and Padme, like, they really complement each other in the same way Anakin does with Obi-Wan, and it's the system that like has planted these cracks in there, and then Anakin is the one who ultimately chooses like to break those cracks into like giant fault lines. So that's his fault. But if they had gotten away from Palpatine and like retired on Naboo together or something, like they would have gotten some couples counseling and they would have been fine. So those are the
Oh.
things that I think about like all the time. So
You know what? If Lucasfilm ever does like a, I know everything is canonical, if they ever do a what if, I would
oh
love to
yeah.
have you. I
Oh
hope
god,
you get to write that story.
I would team up with Kate. Kate could
Fabulous.
write the Padme scenes, and I would write the Anakin scenes, and they would just be like working on a farm together on Naboo, raising their teenagers.
Raising Luke and
Yeah.
oh, fantastic! Obi-Wan Kenobi would have a lot more free time on his hands.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He'd
that's
come in to
great.
visit. He'd just like pop up and say hello there.
Uncle Ben's here. So, do you have a certain film moment that really resonates with you? I know that's a very difficult question.
This one's actually pretty easy because I always go back to like I think the most pivotal moment of Star Wars anything is the opera scene in Revenge of the Sith.
Oh
Like
yes.
everything hinges on that, and the performances by Hayden and Ian McDermott are just so spot on. I love the way I remember. I believe George Lucas said that Ian had a cold that day, and that's why his voice is so like extra gravelly. But like the way that he like pauses and like bites his lip, and he's just kind of watching Anakin's reaction and just like slowly playing with it. And then you can see like the moment it clicks in Anakin when like when Hayden just kind of like turns to him. I love that. It's Star Wars is all about lightsabers and X-wings and good and evil, like fire and ice and everything. But it's like this really, really quiet character moment where like everything in the saga turns, and I love everything about that scene.
Yeah, I've always said Anakin is the most complex. He's the most Shakespearean, and I think that's like
Mhm.
the fulcrum moment. That is the absolute pivotal moment, especially in the prequels, because it changes everything. All right,
Yeah.
so Mike, it's been fabulous talking to you. What is the next project that you're working on that you are allowed to share?
It is the book that I was working on before Star Wars crashed into my life. It's called Vampire Weekend. It comes out next January. It is not about Star Wars at all, but there's a Star Trek reference in it. It's about a woman who deals with the culture clash of being a child of immigrants in the 70s. Like she deals with that by getting really into punk rock and guitars, and then she becomes a vampire. And she spends her immortality by going to shows and playing in bands. But then there's a chance encounter with a teenage relative that forces her to reconnect with her blood family, and she has to confront all these things that she's been avoiding for decades as a vampire, just to do right by this boy who's been really damaged. So it's definitely different in tone from Star Wars, but I think it's been nice that the people who've discovered me by the Star Wars announcement and they've checked out my other books. I think they get a sense of what I'm writing because my stuff is really character driven. It just takes place in like these sci-fi backdrops, and that's really how I approach Brotherhood. Like there's action sequences and there's tension, but it's really a character deep dive into Anakin and Obi-Wan.
And no, it doesn't matter what the special effects or the action or whatever. It's like if you don't have good characters, you don't have a story.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think Star Wars Brotherhood comes out May 10th. I think people are going to love it. Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure to spend some time with you, my friend. Where can people reach out to you if they want to ask you any questions or say hello?
I am mostly on Twitter at Mike Chen Writer. It's really important to put the writer on there because there's a lot of people named Mike Chen in the world. My website is mikechenbooks.com, and I don't update that enough. I really need to. I am also on Instagram at Mike Chen Writer, but that's mostly pictures of my dog because I don't know how to use Instagram very well.
Well, again, Mike, thank you so much for being on Coffee with Kenobi. It's an absolute pleasure to spend time with you.
Thank you so much for having me. And like I said, I've listened to Coffee with Kenobi for years, so it's pretty awesome to be on it.
This podcast is not endorsed by the Walt Disney Company or Lucasfilm Limited. It is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. The official Star Wars website can be found at www.starwars.com. Star Wars, all names, sounds, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Disney and their respective trademark and copyright holders. All original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Coffee with Kenobi unless otherwise indicated.
This is the podcast you're looking for.
There's no one here.